Hi, I'm Lauren Rivers, and welcome to Lauren's Inkwell. Where does your story begin? This is a series of videos containing advice and tips I've learned from years of experience in writing. It's intended as a guide to help you develop a good story from the ground up, regardless of your level of experience. As the title suggests, starting in the right place is key. Think of the timeline as your default status, how everything normally is in your universe or in your character's life. When considering a starting point, you always want to consider that since the story is about conflict, most people's lives typically are, with rare exceptions, generally fairly calm. Usually the big moments are when something huge happens, when there's a disruption in your daily routine, because people tend to follow the pattern that they're not going to change what they're doing unless they have a reason. So you want your story to start when everything changes, when there's a significant shift in the status quo. If you choose the wrong point, it's like starting a dance on the wrong foot. It can result in problems later on when things don't seem like they're lining up the way that they should. For an example, if you're doing a love story, you would pick a point probably just before these two characters that you want to fall in love ever meet. They need time to develop their relationship, maybe have some issues, and whether or not they end up together, the story's going to be focusing on the two of them together or apart. So you want to start right before they would ever come into contact with each other, or at least before their relationship escalates to the next level. If you're doing a sci-fi or a fantasy epic, if you're following the life of a character, maybe they've just lost their job or their ship's about to be impounded. Maybe it's right before two empires are about to make peace in a new star system, or you've discovered a planet that has some resource that your characters will need to fight over. Whatever it is, it should be something significant enough to disturb the status quo. Things after the story, and especially during, should not be the same as they were before. Resist the temptation to start with backstory. Sometimes it can work well, and there are cases where it's appropriate, but be careful, because starting with backstory can backfire. I know that I had done an instance where I had this first chapter that was entirely backstory, which to me it made sense at the time because I was trying to fill in a gap, I guess, between the previous project and the current one, and it kind of seemed interesting, at least at that point, to go back into the character's history and show where they came from. But when I looked at the project objectively on its own, I found you didn't really need it because it didn't really tie into the later story. And that's the key to making a prologue or starting out with backstory, it being necessary. Because if what's happening then doesn't tie into what's happening now, then you don't need it. Now, while the opening chapter worked just fine as its own project and as a standalone piece, it really didn't belong at the beginning of this story. So I ended up deciding that it just didn't work as a prologue and just took it out entirely and redid the opening chapters so that it made more sense with what I had established. So, the plus side to doing a prologue is that you can see how your characters go from where they were to where they're going to be. You want to contrast the past and the present, and ideally, if you can, find a way to link it to whatever's going on now. However, if you just want to tell some backstory, the beginning of your story may not be the best place to do it because people don't know your character yet, so it really doesn't help us to know your character's backstory when we don't even know their present story. As far as whether or not you should do it at all, I can't say you can't do it, but be careful because it can turn out to be a tricky scenario. Now, when you're starting your story, it's going to be a lot of world building at the beginning of the process. So, particularly if you're somebody like me who does a lot of planning on the front end, because, I like to minimize the editing and story reworking that I have to do later. Not to say that it doesn't happen because, of course, you're going to have to edit. That's just one of the rules of writing life. But the more planning you do on the front end, the easier it is when you have to do it at the back end, if that makes sense. So you want to establish a baseline and clarify the rules early. Whatever your universe has to do with, whether it's sci-fi or magic or something completely different, you want to make it clear who the characters are, what the rules are, what can and can't happen in your universe, because new readers are going to want to know this, and it'll help them make sense of what's going on. Because I've read some books, seen some series where it doesn't really tell me exactly what you can and can't do, and I don't really like the universes where it's a free-for-all, where magic is capable of anything as long as you know the right spell without consequences or limits. You need to have rules, at least for me to like your story. And well, I'm okay with some degree of flexibility. I don't expect you to be able to count your bullets or something like that, but I need to at least know we don't have energy weapons. We have magic powers, but they're all elemental. We can teleport. We can only go so far. Whatever the restrictions might happen to be on your system. Are there, people who enforce the rules on misuse of magic? What kind of drive system does your spaceship have? If you tell me these things early, or even if you don't tell the audience this stuff, you need to work it out for yourself, just so that you have it in the back pocket of your mind. So when it comes out later, or when planning future stories, this will help you enable yourself to plan ahead so that everything lines up, and it'll help prevent you writing yourself into a corner. Because if you establish the rules, then you'll keep them in mind whenever you're planning your story. Now, of course, it may turn out that the audience doesn't need to know any of this stuff. However, if you already have it in mind, then everything you plan will line up with those notes. So that'll enable your story to be a lot smoother, and it may in fact even provide you with ideas later on down the line. There are quite a few projects I've worked on where I've come across a concept that wasn't planned for in my original idea. Maybe I couldn't have even conceptualized it, but it just worked so well with what I'd established beforehand. So at least for me, that kind of thing pays dividends, and I think it will for you too. If you know what the rules are, it's a lot easier to keep things lined up. Failure to establish the rules can result in you writing yourself into a problem where you've realized that there's this thing that just doesn't logically make sense, and it's sometimes impossible to fix. In a worst case scenario, you need to restart from zero. Preferably, hopefully, you'll be able to fix it in editing, but the more you plan in the front end, the less problems you'll have later. Now, to help you with this, I suggest having a new character be part of the plot, somebody who doesn't already know the rules. Because, people don't like info dumps, but what helps is if you have a character who has a reason to not know these things, like a new agent applied to your unit, or a new crew member who just got out of the academy, or somebody who's new to campus or something. These characters, they're endearing because we like to get to learn the universe with them. This is particularly why, I in my werewolf project, I had a character that didn't know what the hell was going on, and I also had a character that would be able to impart this information to the rest of the members of the group. Now, this makes sense because this way you can deliver the information to the characters in a logical manner, because it would make sense that this character would pass this information to them, and it doesn't feel like this information is being spoon-fed or force-fed to you out of nowhere. Because you'd find it weird if everybody's an expert in magic and then you have somebody telling these magician experts about magic. It just wouldn't make sense. But if you have a novice magician who's never worked a spell before, that makes sense. They can tell them exactly what they're doing, they can help them figure it out, and with them it makes sense. Now, when you're establishing details in your world building, you need to balance the information between your new audience and anyone who's already read your work. For example, let's say you're doing a sequel project. You still need to figure out where your story starts, but one thing you have to keep in mind when you're starting a sequel project is that you want to balance things between your new audience and your old audience. Don't overload your audience with information that fans will already know, especially hardcore fans. You may need to convey some information that new readers to the series might not necessarily know, but you want to make sure that it's done in such a way that people who are hardcore fans will not be bored by the information you're giving them. Callbacks are nice, but you don't want to dwell on it. So you want to remind people about essential information when it becomes important. If there's something about a previous book or a previous story or comic that your new readers need to know, find a way to work it into the story so that it's essential for one character to tell another character about that event. For example, your apprentice mage in the example earlier. Let's say that you need to tell them about the last adventure saving the world from a world-destroying spell. Well, you might need to relate this story to them when you're trying to explain the current threat. Refresh your audience's memory, convey the info that you need, but don't focus on it so much so that people that have already been familiar with the series are going to be rolling their eyes at you relating for the 80th time how your ship's engines work. And let's see, one more thing I want to touch about as far as starting new stories is that usually, at least in my mind, there are about two different kinds of ways you can do things. And one is something I call rewind storytelling. It's also I've heard it referred to as putting the toys back into the toy box. It kind of results in a lot of formulaic stories. You'll see this in a lot of police procedurals and episodic series. For example, results in, at least in my mind, a limited shelf life. Basically, what it works out to be is that you're forcing all of the characters back to their starting position. Now, you might think of this as taking a day trip. You have to go to wherever it is you're going, do whatever it is you plan to do there, and then you've got to save time to come back and bring everybody back to their homes so that they can be in bed by the time it's midnight. However, with rewind storytelling, this limits how far you can go. Now, this is not to say that you can't do many things with this type of storytelling. For example, if your character lives in a solid place, you can have them go on trips and come back. But there's also another way to approach linked projects or multiple chapters in a book, and that would be the way I usually do things, which is arc-based projects. Now, in an arc-based story, the story evolves just like real life. And the difference is that any choice you make has consequences, regardless of what those are. Whether you do something or you do nothing, any choice, including inaction, has consequences. And the benefit of arc-based storytelling is that these consequences have to be lasting. They have to stick around. If they don't affect everything that comes afterwards, it's not arc-based storytelling. Effectively, it's just like real life. Everything that happens has some effect. Whether it's small, whether it's large, it all blends together. Now, if it's done well with a skilled writer, this can result in some really, really nice, happy accidents. I mean, some of the times where I've worked on arc-based storytelling, I'll get an inspiration because usually, I just kind of work. I start writing and I just let the flow see where it goes. And sometimes I'll get an idea either when I'm working on something or just when I'm watching TV, and when I click it into the slot, it just makes so much sense. And a lot of the things that I do, you can't do if you do it episodic. If I had to get all the characters back home at the end of every chapter, it would never work. But because I choose to just go and see where it takes me and only bring them back at the end of the book, this means I can go much further in my options. So whether you choose to start your story either in the prologue or anywhere in between, make sure that you put a lot of thought into what you're going to need, where you're going to start, and why you're choosing to start at the point you are. Because if you pick the right point, it makes your job as a writer so much easier. That's it for the first installment, and I will see you in part 2 of Lawrence Inkwell, Establishing Characters Quickly. Okay. Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. You can also find me on Twitter and a few other places on the web, or support me via Patreon or Ko-fi. Zebra hugs!